I want you to get together.
Hello everyone, I've got another Remember episode here, and this one may have flown under the radar for a lot of people, especially the new people to waking up, let's say. You know, those who are new to the game and perhaps woke up in the last 3 or 4 years probably wouldn't have heard of this one, or maybe, well, it kind of, when it came, it was big for like 3 to 4 months. And then it kind of just went silent and everyone was over it and moved on, okay? And no one's really talked about it since. And I think it's about 6, maybe 7 years ago now this came out. Around about that time, at least 5 years ago, you know. And it was that this video appeared, which was called No Forrests on Earth. And it was picked up by the Flat Earthers at the time, and someone did a rehash of the whole thing. Because it was originally a Russian guy who made the video, but somebody translated it with an English dub, and they retitled it "No Forest on Flat Earth." So it kind of got hijacked and injected into the Flat Earth movement, and it came under the category of another one of those subjects that goes within that category. But in of itself, the video doesn't talk about that concept of the Earth. It doesn't really talk about the shape of the Earth in any way. It's actually just discussing something very bizarre about the nature of the landscape of the Earth. So the title itself, you know, No Forests on Earth, immediately it makes you think, well, that's just ridiculous. I go for a walk with my dog through forests every Saturday or something. You know what I mean? I see forests, they're around, you know, we know that forests exist. But the concept is an over-dramatization of the idea that what we call forests are practically just moss in comparison to what the Earth used to be like in terms of trees. Trees used to be touching the sky. They were enormous, and the branches would tendril off for miles in directions. You know, they were truly Avatar style, fairyland style giants on the Earth at one point, and trees were huge, and absolutely, like, civilizations were probably built within the branches of these trees in true, you know, like I said, mystical fantasyland imagination of fashion. You can imagine it. You've seen the artwork of people depicting things like this, you know. And it's even described in the Bible that, you know, there is a tree in the center of the earth, basically, that reaches up to the heavens type of thing in the Garden of Eden. And there's a lot of talk about trees as well, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the tree of, you know, the tree of life. People are obsessed with trees in biblical and or religious concepts. The world tree is a really common concept in other pagan belief systems, and it's believed, again, to be the thing that connects heaven to earth. So we know in terms of religious texts that trees have always been considered as something quite holy and important and of a big deal. But when we see trees today, we don't see these enormous giants that literally, you know, just engulf our vision completely into the sky and can be seen for miles. They don't really exist. No, we do have very tall trees up to about 30 meters, but that's pretty much the cap. So the premise of this video, like I said, is that these trees have been cut down. And it goes on to explain that what we actually see when we look at our landscapes, our perceptions are a bit warped, because we see mountains, you know, and hills and quarries and things like that. You know, we see basically, we call them canyons, you know. We see our landscape as it is, and we call it beautiful and natural and amazing, but his claim is that it's a completely terraformed wasteland. What the Earth used to look like was so incredible and beautiful and colourful, with fauna and wildlife, like tree, plant life and foliage, so large and psychedelic that you would just be in awe at witnessing it. And he's basically claiming that something excavated everything and scraped everything away and cut down all the enormous trees. So he then goes on to explore through the landscape examples of basically what are enormous tree stumps, but we call them today flat top mesas. And he goes on to explain how jagged rocked mountains are actually just broken, torn down tree stumps that weren't cut neatly, but were instead snapped. And he shows the comparisons of tree stumps to these mountains in many ways, you know, and you realize they look strikingly similar. And he also goes on to show that there's this thing called the Petrified Forest in the desert in America somewhere. I forget the name now. And it shows that these tree trunk, these huge tree pieces, these circular trees that have all cracked apart, just laid out all over the place. But they've turned to like semi-precious stone. They've it's trees that have turned to stone, and it's just so bizarre to acknowledge this thing that exists, you know. And it's kind of, how does wood turn to stone in outside conditions without pressure? It's just bizarre. It doesn't make any sense, you know. It seems like these aren't tree trunks. What he's saying, they are tree branches, twigs, sticks that fell to the earth when the big tree was cut down. And he points to the background of this image and says those mountains in the background are the stumps of where the tree was. And these little things you see on the ground, these petrified pieces of wood, are just the twigs that fell off. And it's one of those theories that gives you this trippy perspective change, you know. And these appear every now and then, and this is what grabbed the attention and the imaginations of so many people when this theory came about, because it does make you suddenly view the world from a completely different lens very quickly. You know, it snaps things into place, and it's kind of like, whoa. It makes us feel very small very quickly as well. It was one of those type of theories. But this documentary goes on for an hour and a bit, and it showcases a lot of stuff, okay, and it breaks it down and shows that, you know, maybe we are truly just living in the wastes of an utterly decimated land, you know. And he goes on to say, for example, volcanoes, these mounds, these conical shaped mounds we see that spew stuff out the top every now and then, you know, through violent chemical reactions, are actually just waste, just piles of remnant slag and waste left over from the production of cutting down these trees. And they've just dumped all the waste stuff into a pile over there, and we call them beautiful mountains and volcanoes now. You know, he goes on to use the Grand Canyon as an example, and he says, you know, people look at this Grand Canyon and think it's a beautiful natural wonder, when what they're actually marveling at is just a huge quarry, a waste quarry, an emptied, hollowed out quarry of where something precious was that's just been removed. And we're in awe at this thing, told it appeared over millions of years through water erosion. What this documentary claims, this guy is claiming that this is excavated land. This is land that has been mined, and you're just seeing what's left behind, you know. And it's been called a national park in true cynical fashion, when that's just not what it is at all, you know. And that is just an interesting perspective to take. There's this other idea, you know, that the trees on Earth don't seem to be any older than like 300 to 400, 500 years old. They're all quite fresh, new trees. So he was theorizing that whatever happened didn't happen that long ago. You know, whatever this excavation thing was, it wasn't such a long time ago at all. It's in our relatively recent past. And there was such a decimated thing that all the trees had to reset and grow from scratch again, from the roots, from the base, you know, and all the surface level trees were just annihilated. So it's interesting to think he goes down the route of nuclear war, I think, and the idea that an advanced civilization of people who lived among all these trees basically wiped each other out with powerful, vicious weapons, and the blasts of things that knocked over these giant trees in some respects, and many of them were cut down, and the wood was used for resources to build cities and weapons and other things. You know, he has all his ideas and theories to what happened, though it's not very cohesive. And funnily enough, in the modern day, we now have this Tartarian idea that there was, not so long ago, a reset of some kind, and a ancient advanced civilization known as Tartaria built all these wonderful buildings and cities that are look gorgeous, made of such detailed stonework. And it's kind of like, how did people with horse and carts build them? You know, I suppose our real history is the truth. So the theory is, you know, a reset happened that annihilated this ancient culture, this advanced culture, and we are now living in the ruins of that culture, you know, and we just inhabited the buildings that were left behind, and we didn't build them at all. So they kind of fit in together, you know, and this no forests thing was kind of a precursor, I suppose, to get people ready for the idea of the Tartarian thing. If you want to get really conspiratorial about it and consider these that they may be all controlled opposition, misinformation in a sense. It's possible this may have some roots in the whole Anatoly Fomenko's idea, who kind of coined this Russian supremacist ancient Tartarian mythos. The New Chronology was his book, which kind of rewrites history in a sense and makes it this way. But I find I only say that because the original creator of this is Russian, so it's possible he was inspired by those works of this famous mathematician from his own country, you know. But other than that, you know, the documentary is fascinating. It does put things into perspective, and I think there are kernels of truth in it. If the Archon invasion that mined Earth for all its precious resources isn't the answer, you know, there's still something there. Because a lot of people did go down that Zecharia Sitchin route to explain it, that it's the Anunnaki who come into our solar system every so often and then mine the Earth for resources for its own planet, and then they bugger off, you know, and leave us in with the mess, basically. And they use us as a slave class to do all the mining. And there was many theories around 2012 period that Nibiru is returning and the Anunnaki are coming back, you know, to enslave us once more. People even say it was those who created us to be a slave class. So this no forest thing, people have many perspective views and theories about what it is. The biblical perspective would explain it in Enoch, that the trees were cut down by the angels to stop the giants from escaping the flood. And the flood can be the explanation for why a lot of these trees were annihilated and destroyed and snapped off their roots. And what we see now in this world is just a decimated land, you know, where everything had to restart. But the flood was, well, roughly 5,000 years ago, if you go through the biblical timeline. So that doesn't explain why they have these trees that are quite fresh. And the strange phenomena I looked into as to why we don't have many very old trees. So some of the oldest known trees are said to be 5,000 years old, but there's only like a few, like 3. And they're just predicting that's how old they are. And they're dead. They're not really alive, these trees, and they look absolutely battered. Like, they look like they've just been ruined. You know, they're like an empty husk of a tree. You wouldn't call them a tree by today's standards, and they're not even that big, to be honest. They're just dead, withered, battered monstrosities of former glory of trees, you know. And these really old trees, you go onto Wikipedia, for example, and you search for them, and there's literally like 50. There's like 50 trees that are maybe that constitute being over 500 years old, you know, and they're all like UNESCO heritage sites, and they're all cornered off from people and boxed off. And if you go on Google Maps, they've got their own little icon of a tree to say this is where this really old tree is, you know. So we've documented them all, and to the point where there's not even that many. And the ones that do exist, you actually look into it even more, and they are dead. They're actually classified as dead trees, so they're not even alive. And they're even counting stumps as trees, as old trees, the remaining stump of them an old tree, you know what I mean? So there actually isn't that many old trees around. They do exist, you know, there are some 2,000-year-old trees, let's say, and things like that, but not enough. There should be forests of them, you know what I mean? Where are the forests? Where are the trees that really kept growing and weren't hindered? Why don't we see many of them? You know, the redwoods are one example. But even then, they are tiny in comparison to the supposed size of some of these trees. Devil's Tower is a great example in America as well, and this is where another aspect of the theory kind of comes in. They're talking about, and they have a hexagonal shape to the rocks that grow up, and he says, you know, we're told this is done by lava and magma coming up from the earth. Though it doesn't make any sense. Why would it form hexagonal shapes that separate from one another? We know what lava acts like, and it doesn't act like that. Liquids don't perform like this. So what he basically summarizing shows is that if you cut a flax stem in half and look at under a microscope, it looks identical to how Devil's Tower would look. And this is actually an organic matter that you're looking at. This is a result of something organic. Only organic things create the hexagonal shape like this. It's kind of what he's theorizing. And what we're looking at is basically the stem of an enormous flax plant of some kind, or what he claims a silicon-based pillar, which would create this pattern and this effect. A large part of the theory was based that life back then wasn't primarily carbon-based, but it was also a huge chunk, if not majority, silicon-based, unlike today. So these plants turning to stone is kind of explained by this idea that it's actually it's silicon, not carbon. Which is, again, interesting, and it means these trees wouldn't have looked necessarily like our trees. They would have been a very bizarre looking silicon-based pillar of a sorts. And I've heard a lot of people discuss the silicon pillars since this theory came around, you know, that reached up to the heavens as kind of like ladders to heaven in a way. And maybe that's what Devil's Tower actually was. What you're seeing is the stump, the remaining stump of this organic, mattered, grown, enormous tree type thing made of silicon. And he goes to other examples where we see these basalt rock salt formations, such as Giant's Causeway, and also things like salt lakes have that same pattern. And he's saying these flat salt lakes was some kind of living creature at one point that basically just got scraped away from the land, you know, which is interesting. Some kind of huge organism that was just sliced off the earth and removed and harvested. Giant's Causeway is an example of one of these stumps that was cut, and then the silica hexagons tried to keep growing. So now you have this weird layered effect, you know, because it was a living organism of a sort, and now it's just turned to stone. Very fascinating. You know, this kind of fits in with these other ideas, these other theories out there, that what we see as mountain ranges or some islands are actually the bodies of the giants as well. And there's plenty of photos out there that kind of hint to this idea that people have been hinting at, that we are seeing petrified organic matter everywhere. Things that used to be flesh have turned to stone due to some extreme event that happened that caused the conditions for this to happen, you know. And perhaps these giant trees and the giants themselves fit into this process. Who cut down the giant trees? Well, again, we don't really know. Biblically speaking, it's said that the angels are the ones that cut down the trees, if you're going to go for Enoch. But I think, you know, the New Age angle, the Gnostic angle, the one people went down mainly to describe this idea is that the earth was ruined and destroyed by a cruel, evil race of monsters, in a sense, who have subjugated mankind and destroyed our home. So again, it's usually the Anunnaki Archon theory, you know. But if it's the case that actually it was God who did it himself as a way to stop the giants from being able to climb above the floodwaters, then that actually makes sense, historically speaking, you know. But in terms of our timeline, it confuses things, because then it's like, well, how long ago was the flood actually? You know, so if we can get back to the Grand Canyon, you know, I've seen people argue that the Grand Canyon is a result of the flood actually. Gushes of torrents of water tore that huge chunk of land out of the central of America. It was the force of the water, so it was water erosion, but it happened quickly, not slowly over millions of years. But this guy's theory is that, no, this was excavated. This is excavated land, and he shows the formations of the rocks, the layers, as being the same as excavated layers today through mining projects. They're comparably the same, you know, and the tool that they would have used would have been an enormous rotary cutter of some kind. And these things exist today. So I did some research and I looked into it, and it turns out these enormous rotary blades, you know, they have like 5 per mining site. And they are huge, you know, but I've looked at what they actually look like from an aerial view, these mining projects, and they don't look anything like the Grand Canyon, actually. And see, this is the thing, that there's this effect that, there's a name for it. I'll put it up on the screen now. I forgot it right now, but there's a name for the pattern that's been formed by the Grand Canyon. And it's the same pattern that gets formed when you run electricity through a piece of wood. It's the same pattern that gets created through lightning. It's the same pattern that trees create as they branch off from one another. And that's the same thing that's happening when you look at the Grand Canyon. To me, the Grand Canyon from an aerial perspective doesn't look like a mining project. It actually looks like electricity, scoring of electricity that tore up the land very quickly again. Because you can see by the way the fractal patterns dissipate from the central veins of the Grand Canyons itself. So it looks like electrical phenomena to me, not a mining project. From the very small myopic view of being on the ground level, I can see how you can make the comparisons to it looking like a mining project, maybe. And maybe sections of it perhaps were mined. I mean, that's possible. But on the grand scale, from an aerial perspective, it doesn't look like any form of mining project whatsoever. There is actually, in Germany, they are mining for coal in one particular spot, and there's a lot of controversy around the whole mining process there and why they're mining for coal, because they stupidly shut down their nuclear power plants after Fukushima, and they needed to replace it with something, so they replaced it with cheap, dirty, horrible, low quality coal, which they're mining from this particular spot in Germany. But if you look at it from an aerial view, you can see a time lapse of the process of the mining, and this is covering kilometers of land, you know, a big patch of land, and you'll find those rotary cutters, these mining projects, which he's basically claiming similar technology was used, don't look like the Grand Canyon. They don't make that pattern. It looks like a mess, in fact. A layered mess, yes, like the layers we see in Grand Canyon, but not the same from an aerial perspective. And so I don't think it was the case. Maybe there's some truth to this theory, but there's a lot of holes. Easily disprovable holes. Like I said, it just took a few cursory looks at Google Maps and a bit of research into excavators to see that the pattern he's claiming is a result of mining isn't how mining operations end up looking from a true aerial viewpoint, but it is what electrical phenomena looks like when it scores the earth. And it's not what rivers look like, which is what it's claimed it was. It's not what water erosion looks like either. So I don't know if any of this is actually true, but I do remember when this came about, it grabbed people. People were obsessed with this for a very short while, you know. And I think it's one of those topics that come along that people have probably easily forgotten about. They probably have, you know. And again, for those new people out there who are just waking up, go and check this one out. You know, this is an old one now by you know, truth standards, because everything's changing all the time and always new stuff is coming out. This is something of the past now, but it's still interesting to watch and listen to, and it makes you, if you don't take it as truth, it's at least a good exercise in remembering that what we have been told is likely a lie, and our perspective on things truly does matter, you know, and it can change very quickly. And this theory is kind of evidence of how we could change our perspective to see the world in a whole new light. If not as the truth, but as a fun thought experiment. So I'd recommend going to watch it just for that reason. But who remembers? Let me know in the comments if you were around during this time. Do you remember the No Forrests on Flat Earth video? So there's a quick one for you guys, a quick remember episode. I'll be back with more videos soon. Thanks for listening, and as always, God bless.
I want you to get together.